Well, hello everyone. This is Barry Jones with Standards Plus History Academy, and we are on our final JFK assassination episode, the series that has gone on for a while. I literally started on January 7th, and I'm finishing on May 23rd. And about half that time I went 6 days a week. So, and there's so much more I could add. I mean, that's a semester's worth of material, just so you know. It's actually more because I don't teach in school 6 days a week. And those of you who have ever taught, have any experience teaching, you never lecture 5 straight days. There's always a break. So this is probably 3/4 of an entire school year, which is 180 days. So it's probably close to 120 days, maybe, worth of material. And this is why I sell this curriculum on my website as a year-long class, or at least that's what it will end up being. And any gap will be filled as I proceed further because I'm always learning something new. Sometimes it's from you guys. So today is titled, How Do All the Puzzle Pieces Fit Together? And I don't claim to know everything. I'm not going to try to answer every question. I'm just going to tell you how it makes sense in my mind, and maybe that will resonate with some, I hope. So, 3 questions I want to answer. First is, how did the 5 conspirators integrate? And if you've stayed with me for a while, you know that I broke it down into 5 conspirators, each with their different motives, each with their different payoffs, and each with their different responsibilities and roles. So the temptation is to think they all handled their business separately. They didn't. There was overlap, there was crossover. This was a thoroughly integrated plot. Two, how did the 5 conspirators immunize themselves? I'm convinced that before this plot even began, this end result was carefully managed by whom they selected to be in the plot, whom was approached, and what their specific roles were. Because when it was all said and done, everyone involved in the plot had to be guaranteed immunity, just like ultravires. You know, we talked about that in the deep state. They literally brought that corporate mindset of immunity from any liability into the conspiracy to kill JFK. And you'll see it's beautifully done. You have to admire the craftiness, which tells you that this was not orchestrated by half-wits and revenge-minded Cubans or mafia. It was somebody who had familiarity with this process and the concept of ultravires. And then the third question is, how did the 5 conspirators benefit themselves? We've sort of touched on that already. I'll just kind of go over that quickly each as we proceed through. But it's always necessary when you're solving a crime. First place you look is who benefited from that crime being committed. It's one of the reasons why I have this friend of mine who's in law enforcement, and when we talk, he'll share stories with me, and he's a detective, so he'll tell me who he looks at first when there's a crime and he's assigned to investigate it. It's almost always close family member or business partner, somebody they all know, or somebody that knew the victim. And it's kind of like Julius Caesar, when he looks at Brutus, his best friend, and as he's being stabbed, you too, Brutus, you know. Um, so it's usually somebody that has close relationship, and of course these 5 conspirators all had close relationship with President Kennedy. You look at up in the right hand corner, the deep state, which I define as the national security apparatus and the corporations that feed it. That would include the CIA, the FBI, the Pentagon. He was the commander in chief. He dealt with the CIA on a daily basis. And Hoover from the FBI. Secret Service obviously protected him up until they didn't, when they didn't. Lyndon Johnson was his vice president. The mafia, top left, that's the symbol for the mafia, organized crime figures. He had a familiarity through his family with organized crime that went back decades. And in Alpha 66, probably the least familiar with Alpha 66 or with the Cubans, but he did know them. He'd had them to the White House, and he'd gone down to the Orange Bowl, and he met regularly with some of the folks that were in charge of these little splinter groups. He, through his brother, met most times. So he probably, the Cubans had the least relationship with the president, but they all had some level. Some of them were very close. So those are the three questions we want to answer. And trying to get my PowerPoint to, there we go. All right, so what I've done is I've created a series of flowcharts. And I start with the Pentagon because I believe this is where it started. I believe it was the Joint Chiefs who spread the word. I believe the word came down from on high from the Joint Chiefs that it was on. And nothing had to be written down on paper. Nothing had to be said. No words had to explain what that meant. He went, Joint Chiefs, people like Curtis LeMay, got word to Ed Lansdale, who was their operations manager, basically handled their business for them. And by the way, whenever you see next to a name Dallas in parentheses, it's because that person was, according to witnesses, in Dallas on the day JFK was killed. Now, Ed Lansdale, the witnesses are his former employees, the people who worked underneath him, who saw the picture of the tramps and the guy walking next to the tramps with his back to the camera, turned slightly towards the tramps, and they all identify Ed Lansdale as being that person making eye contact with the tramps. We talked about that in an earlier episode. And the first person to notice it was his direct subordinate, L. Fletcher Prouty. And the way that this flowchart was supposed to work was the Joint Chiefs would give an order to Ed Lansdale. Ed Lansdale will give an assignment to L. Fletcher Prouty, and Prouty would handle all the details. His job was to act as liaison between the Joint Chiefs and the CIA. One of the things that we've learned by now, hopefully, is that the way that you rig something or the way that you corrupt something, first and foremost, is by choosing carefully the personnel to eliminate or get rid of, to get out of the way, because they might be a straight arrow, they might be a threat to the plot, they might be a threat to what you're trying to achieve. We saw it with the Secret Service over and over again. One of the first decisions Ed Lansdale makes is to send L. Fletcher Prouty on vacation during the time in which this plan is going to be implemented, so that he cannot have a chance to affect its outcome. And of course, Fletcher Prouty learned about the JFK assassination while he was in Sweden, ostensibly on a vacation, escorting VIPs around. And he's the one that started putting the pieces together and realized what was going on as he was reading the news accounts of Lee Harvey Oswald the next day and how detailed it was, calculated that this looked a lot like a cover story. And so began piecing together all of the responsibilities that he would have normally been in charge of, responsible for, had he not been on this forced vacation, and found out that many of the things he was assigned to do as a matter of routine didn't get done, and exposed the president to the plot in Dallas. And that's the sum and substance of his book, The Secret Team. So anyway, now that Ed Lansdale has gotten L. Fletcher Prouty out of the way, he is free to act as the liaison with the CIA himself and deal directly with the director of the CIA, Allen Dulles. There is no one more central to the planning and the actual carrying out of this plot than Allen Dulles. But he is getting the word from the military, from the Joint Chiefs, that it's on. And another figure that was contacted by Ed Lansdale was J. Edgar Hoover. And you'll see he was also in Dallas on the day JFK was assassinated. Uh, Lansdale, the liaison between Joint Chiefs was not just with CIA, it was also with FBI. It was with the intelligence community. So whenever I talk about the intelligence community, I'm talking about CIA and FBI. So it's Allen Dulles and J. Edgar Hoover. Well, notifying J. Edgar Hoover means notifying LBJ. LBJ and Hoover are tight. They're friends. They're neighbors. They live across the street from each other in Washington. And so friendly, in fact, that LBJ, when he later becomes president, appoints J. Edgar Hoover FBI director for life. So the notifications have been made. The Joint Chiefs have sent the word down. Ed Lansdale has looped L. Fletcher Prouty out of it. He has contacted the intelligence community himself, Allen Dulles and J. Edgar Hoover. Hoover now has reached out to his friend, LBJ, who, as you see, was also in Dallas on that day. And of course, notifying Hoover means, and I've got these arrows in the wrong place. I was up late last night doing this, and this should all be tied into organized crime, and the anti-Castro Cubans should be arrowed back to Allen Dulles and the CIA, because it was Allen Dulles and the CIA who were in partnership with organized crime and the anti-Castro Cubans. We've talked about this, how the CIA did all the planning. They were the strategists. They handled things strategically with respect to Cuba, and they partnered with organized crime. And there were all kinds of organized crime figures in Dallas on that day. And they also partnered with anti-Castro Cubans, and there were all kinds of anti-Castro Cubans in Dallas on that day. And the partnership was all in an effort to overthrow Castro. So I hope you can see what I'm talking about. The LBJ, Hoover notifies LBJ, who then notifies James Raleigh. Those arrows are correct. The organized crime and anti-Castro should be arrowed from Allen Dulles and the CIA. I apologize for that. I will fix that after I'm finished. This is what happens when you're doing a show after a late night. So all of the notifications now have been made, and you can see by the Joint Chiefs giving the word, we already have all 5 conspirators looped in. You have the military, you have the CIA, and you have the FBI. That is the deep state. That is conspirator number 1. You have organized crime, which has been notified through Allen Dulles, and you have the anti-Castro Cubans, which have also been notified, the leadership, through Allen Dulles. Those are conspirators 2 and 3. And you have LBJ, who's been notified by Hoover. That is conspirator number 4. And notifying LBJ means notifying James Raleigh, his friend on the Secret Service. And of course, the Secret Service is going to be extremely pivotal in this, which is why LBJ is looped in by Hoover, because he knows LBJ's relationship with Raleigh. So Raleigh now puts in motion, and we'll get to the Secret Service flowchart. And of course, LBJ is also necessary for the immunity, because LBJ is going to be the president when this is all said and done. He's going to be in a position to choose the Warren Commission. And he's going to decide who is on that Warren Commission, which ends up being 6 military vets and 1 intelligence vet. Well, that guarantees immunity for at least the Joint Chiefs, when 6 of the investigators are military veterans. And it guarantees the CIA immunity, because the guy running it, Allen Dulles, is an intelligence vet. And of course, they're going to get all their evidence from J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI, so that guarantees immunity for the FBI. And since the CIA is partnered with organized crime and anti-Castro Cubans in a long-running partnership to assassinate Castro, to overthrow his government, they're not going to permit exposure of organized crime and anti-Castro Cubans, because that would lead back to the CIA. So they have immunity. And LBJ himself has immunity because he's the president. Any investigation of LBJ, as we're going to learn, shuts down immediately once he becomes president. And because he roped in Raleigh into this, he's going to promote some people in the Secret Service and immunize the Secret Service as well, as we'll find out 15 years later. When the House Select Committee is chastising the Secret Service, they asked James Raleigh, did anybody involved in the Secret Service on this day in Dallas get fired? No. Reprimanded? No. What happened to them? They got promoted. Why didn't they get punished? I think they suffered enough. Everyone from the get-go is guaranteed immunity by whom is selected to be involved in this conspiracy. Primarily LBJ. That pretty much gives them all blanket immunity because he selects the Warren Commission. So you see how choosing the personnel, choosing the agencies, choosing who to tell. It wasn't all the Joint Chiefs that went to Lansdale. It was one. It wasn't Lansdale who went through official channels and wrote up a document to give to Allen Dulles saying, hey, this is what we're going to do. It was word of mouth. He went to the intelligence community, possibly both, maybe just one who shared it with the other. But however it happened, he roped in Allen Dulles and J. Edgar Hoover. By doing that, he roped in the CIA and the FBI, knowing Allen Dulles would bring organized crime to the table, knowing Allen Dulles would bring the Cubans to the table. Of course, the organized crime had been financing a lot of the covert ops the CIA was running against Castro. So that will be handy. Or the anti-Castro Cubans have been the foot soldiers in a lot of these operations against Castro. So that will be handy. And once you bring LBJ into this, because J. Edgar Hoover is going to let LBJ know, because everybody knows the Secret Service is going to have to know. Well, who is the guy that's going to talk to the Secret Service? It's LBJ through James Raleigh. And once you do that, you've got all 5 conspirators ready to go. And you've got the immunity guaranteed on the front end and the back by who's going to be the president when this is all said and done, and who selects the Warren Commission and how it is comprised, and how the members, what their backgrounds are that comprise this Warren Commission. It's beautiful. It's beautiful. But it had to start with somebody or something. I believe it started with the Pentagon, the Joint Chiefs. So what are the payoffs for the Pentagon? Well, you remember Kennedy was going to shut down 73 bases. That didn't happen. The Vietnam War was not going to happen. That did happen. And today's money spent over $1 trillion fighting that war. The Cold War, which was going to end in Kennedy's second term, that was the plan, continued for 28 more years, spending $10 trillion more dollars, U.S. taxpayer money. And the Pentagon spending, which just grew and grew and grew during that 28-year period, continues to grow to this day, to the tune of about $1 trillion a year now. So about a Vietnam War every year. And I've listed all these different wars, and it's not a completely comprehensive list. It's the most well known. We've had a lot of different interventions along the way, starting with Korea, Vietnam, Grenada, Beirut, Libya, Panama, Persian Gulf, Somalia, Haiti, Yugoslavia, Afghanistan, Libya, Iraq, Syria, and now Ukraine. So if you are the Pentagon, look at all the money that has been spent and continues to be spent, that if Kennedy lives and wins a second term and is succeeded by his brother in 68, he serves 2 terms, and is succeeded by his brother, Teddy, and he serves 2 terms, which was the plan at that moment. None of this happens. None of it. So the military industrial congressional complex woke up and realized what needed to be done for their own survival purpose, for the sake of their own survival. Kennedy was a threat, in their view, to their survival. And of course, we know that's nonsense. We know that's not true. We would have still had a Pentagon. We'd have still had an Army and a Navy and a Marines and an Air Force. But the complex that depended on all this military spending would have seized up. The money spigot would have turned off. Instead of this being a financial boondoggle for the military industrial congressional complex, it would have been the Sahara Desert. So you see the payoffs. It's not hard to see what their motivation was there. All right, let's look at the CIA flowchart. All right, so again, you have Alan Dulles right here, primary. He's been informed now. He's got his marching orders from Lansdale. And of course, he's eventually going to petition the new president to be on that Warren Commission, which is going to immunize all of his people. And Hoover's already involved. He's been roped in by Lansdale as well. And that's going to immunize the Warren Commission to whatever conclusion they reach. They can always claim, well, that we studied all the evidence that was given us. And of course, all the evidence that was given them came straight from J. Edgar Hoover. So these three are working together. These three entities, these two people are working in tandem together to immunize themselves, their people, and the Warren Commission. So now that that's been handled, let's look at some of the primary players in the green column first. At the top, and I have a star next to his name, William Pauly. William Pauly was not actually a CIA asset or an agent or an officer. He was one of these E.F. Hutton types that, because of his military experience in World War II, he was a flying ace. He led the Flying Tigers. He had experience in naval matters. He had a ton of money. Yeah, he was this entrepreneur, made a lot of money, and he had all this experience in military matters. And so he became one of these sort of hidden assets the CIA used, kind of like Howard Hughes. Money, expertise in all things military, creative, and interested in all things anti-communist. So William Pauly was involved, and we know he was involved with the S-Force because it was his yacht that was transporting the S-Force on that particular raid to Cuba. We heard the story. He was talking to John Martino. Martino was bitching about Kennedy and shutting down Operation Mongoose. And Pauly, while waiting for the S-Force to return from a mission to Cuba, I was sitting on a boat, told Martino, according to the author, who was sitting on the boat from Time Life, told Martino, don't worry, John, we're going to kill that blankety blank. So we know he has, and of course, the S-Force is the assassination team put together to kill Castro. We also know that the S-Force ended up in Dallas. Several of its, more than several of its members ended up in Dallas. So William Pauly has connections to the S-Force, which ended up in Dallas. Richard Bissell is the number 2 in the CIA at this time under Alan Dulles. And we know that he had connections to a separate assassination program, separate from the S-Force, separate from executive action. Executive action, if you recall, was a William Harvey-led assassination program to assassinate foreign heads of state using foreign nationals. We found out about that during the church hearings. What we also found out about during the church hearings was there was another assassination program called the ZR Rifle, also led by William Harvey. Every assassination program the CIA ever had, Harvey was involved in it, including the S-Force, by the way. Anyway, Richard Bissell and Richard Helms signed off on the creation document. If you recall, William Harvey and Arnold Silver put together a creation document for ZR Rifle 2 weeks after JFK took office. And this was in January of 61. And so they take that creation document to Richard Bissell and Richard Helms. They both sign off on it and inform Alan Dulles, who has authorized this whole thing, that the creation document has been finished and they've signed off on it. It's now ready to be implemented. in April of 61, or March of 61, ZR rifle began officially. And of course, we learned from Mary Haverstick that ZR rifle had one primary agent through whom a lot of their activities were funneled through it. And the agent's code name was QJ Wynn, who was June or Jerry Cobb, depending upon what name she was using at that time. And of course, she was sitting at the airfield, at Red Bear Airfield in Dallas on the day JFK was assassinated. So far, the people, William Pauly's people end up in Dallas, the S-Force. Richard Bissell and Richard Helms' agent with ZR rifle ends up in Dallas. William Harvey himself didn't end up in Dallas on that day, but he'd been there 2 weeks prior, which he had no reason to be there. He was the head of the station, CIA station in Rome, Italy, but he went to Dallas to, quote, look around. So he had been in Dallas. He wasn't there on the day. That leads us to the number 3 in the CIA. His name is Charles Cabell. Cabell had a very important connection in this, and that is that his brother, Earl Cabell, was the mayor of Dallas. So obviously Earl Cabell was in Dallas on the day JFK was assassinated, and he played a very pivotal role in getting the motorcade changed at the last second to include a 90-degree turn and a 120-degree turn, bringing the motorcade and the limo right through the kill zone, Dealey Plaza. And the 4th guy in the green column, James Jesus Angleton, is responsible for Lee Harvey Oswald in his early days in the military when he became a CIA asset, recruiting him into the fake defector program. After which he'd been trained, he was sent to Russia as a fake defector to carry out a mission. This is something people don't talk about a lot, is what was the mission? You assume it's to gather intelligence, but he was never even debriefed when he returned from Russia. And he had no way of getting information out while he was there at Russia. They were intercepting all his mail. So it couldn't be that. Could it be that he was sent there to sabotage something? Possibly a peace summit in Paris that was set to occur between Nikita Khrushchev and Eisenhower. And the way in which it was sabotaged was to give military secrets, which he said he was going to do, to the Soviets about the U-2 spy plane, which he had access to and he had knowledge of because he worked at Sugi, had top secret security clearances about the U-2 plane, radar secrets. 6 months after Oswald arrived in Russia, Francis Gary Powers was shot down. That plane had been untouchable. Then, after his mission succeeds and is over, he applies to go home to the United States, which if he's truly a defector, it would never happen, or he would be tried as a traitor for treason. But no, James Jesus Angleton not only got him in as a fake defector, got him back and repatriated him, and the State Department paid for his trip. No repercussions whatsoever. And where does this Lee Harvey Oswald CIA asset end up on the day JFK is assassinated? He's in Dallas. You go on to the 5th guy in the green list or green column, David Atlee Phillips. David Atlee Phillips takes over for James Jesus Angleton once Oswald is repatriated, and his job is to create the cover story, to sheep dip Oswald. And there's the scenario in New Orleans, the summer of '63, where Oswald is working under all these CIA and with all these CIA people, including Clay Shaw, including Guy Bannister, David Ferry, all the Operation Mongoose Cubans. He's going up and down the streets very publicly, handing out pro-Castro literature. He's creating the Fair Play for Cuba Committee at the direction of Guy Bannister, who, of course, is getting his orders from David Atlee Phillips. By the time Oswald is accused of assassinating the president, the legend has been created. This guy is a pro-Castro Marxist. He's a Castro lover. He's been to Russia, came home, married a Russian woman. David Atlee Phillips also created that fantastic September Mexico City cover story, which fell apart later when the photos were clearly not Oswald. The voice on the tapes were clearly not those of Oswald's. But the impetus behind that was to show him making final arrangements for the assassination, up to and including getting advice from a Russian assassination expert, KGB expert Kostakov, and also arranging through passports and travel visas an escape plan to either Cuba or Russia afterwards. This was all part of the cover story. And then in the month of the assassination, or prior to the assassination, when they reassigned him to Dallas, it was Atlee Phillips who was populating the Dallas community and surrounding area with doppelgangers that were laying a trail of incriminating evidence back to Oswald that could be thrown into this pot of stew. And when all this is released, this is what triggered L. Fletcher Prouty to the presence of a cover story. This had been done a million times in his line of work. He understood how it worked. When he's reading the newspaper account, it looked like a cover story straight out of his files. There was all the prep work. There was the cover story that came and it had CIA fingerprints all over it. And then there were all these doubles running around laying this trail. Some of them he knew immediately were doubles because they were on top of each other. Two people in different places at the same time claiming to be Oswald. Couldn't be. They did too good a job. But all this is handled by Atlee Phillips. By the way, Atlee Phillips was seen in Dallas talking with Lee Harvey Oswald. He went by a code name Maurice Bishop in the days before the assassination. So we know he was in Dallas, not on that day, probably, but he was there days before. And then you have Ted Shackley. Ted Shackley was the CIA officer in charge of J.M. Wade, the station in Miami, from which a lot of these characters come. William Harvey ran executive action out of Miami. David Morales, Frank Sturgis, E. Howard Hunt, all part of Operation Mongoose, also part of the S-Force, all of which ended up in Dallas on the day JFK was assassinated. E. Howard Hunt put David Morales high up with William Harvey as the planners for the assassination. Frank Sturgis was, according to Marita Lorenz, traveled with her from Miami to Dallas the night before, bring weapons, got paid by E. Howard Hunt, and of course called her later and said, "You should have stayed in Dallas with us. We killed the president that day," and went on to brag about how easy it was. And then of course E. Howard Hunt denied it for years until the CIA outed him with their own memo saying someday we're going to have to explain why Hunt was in Dallas on that day. This was after Watergate when he became expendable. So on his deathbed, E. Howard Hunt finally confessed to being a bench warmer in the plot to kill the president. So he was in Dallas on that day. You noticing a trend? All these people in green are the organizers. They're the ones in charge, but their people in blue are carrying out these functions, carrying out these jobs, and most of them are ending up in Dallas on the day JFK was killed. Now, the one at the bottom, Cord Meyer, I don't have a lot to say about Cord Meyer. I include him in this list because E. Howard Hunt included him in his flow chart and said that he was one of the primary planners of all this. And of course, he was the husband of Mary Pinchot-Meyer, the lady who had an affair with JFK when he was a senator. I have not done enough research yet to say conclusively one way or the other. I'm including him in this list because E. Howard Hunt included him in the list, high up. So it's not like it was a mistake. He just threw him in there and said, I think he did something. No, he included him high up. In fact, he put his name right under LBJ. So he did something. I'm just telling you, I don't know what it is yet. Maybe in the next year, I'll find that out. All right, so we've seen how the CIA organized their part to play in this, how it immunized itself through Allen Dulles to J. Edgar Hoover and through both of their contributions to the Warren Commission. What are the payoffs of the CIA? Well, obviously they had a chief antagonist whose name was JFK. He's gone. National Security Action Memo to green light the process towards Vietnam War is signed on the 26th, canceling out JFK's National Security Action Memo 263. National Security Action Memo 273 prepares the field for the Gulf of Tonkin incident, which prepares the field, the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, which prepares the field for the Vietnam War. That was a CIA-led war. Then, bottom column, the Cold War goes on for 28 more years. CIA was involved heavily in all of these battlefronts. The war on terror, after the Cold War ends, we just seamlessly transition from one war to the next. And of course, the war on terror caused by a precipitating event, which we'll get to that a little bit later today, 9/11. And of course, this is all CIA activity, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria. It's just like a blank check to the CIA to declare war on anybody. If you declare them terrorists or accessories to terrorism or anything of that nature. And then lastly, the biggest payoff to the CIA has been its control over the executive branch, i.e. the president. And we did this in an earlier episode. I'm not going to regurgitate all that, but every president subsequent to JFK has had some tie-in. Some of them are really obvious, like George H.W. Bush was a former director of the CIA. Can't get any more connected than he is. But there's only been a couple exceptions, and they've made life hell for those couple exceptions. But otherwise, everyone is under the thumb of the CIA. Every president is basically a Manchurian. Since Kennedy, we haven't really had an independent president other than two. And so you're talking about, after Kennedy, you got LBJ, then you got Nixon, then you got Ford, and then you got Carter, and you got Reagan, and then you got Bush #1, and then you got Clinton, then you got Bush #2, and then you got who's after Bush #2? Why am I forgetting? Oh, Obama, and then after Obama, you got Trump, and then you got Biden. That's 11 presidents, I think, if I counted right, and 9 of them have been directly under the control of the CIA. And the other 2 have been victimized by the CIA. So they control. You talk about shadow government. All right, now let's look at the organized crime, organized labor flow chart. And this story begins with the 5412 committee, which I explained all that in an earlier episode. And Nixon, being the vice president, was the chairperson of the 5412 committee. This is the super secret classified committee that handles all covert ops for the CIA. And so as such, everything that comes out of there is classified, completely top secret. So there's your immunity. You can see this is where it all starts with organized crime, organized labor. So everything that flows from it is going to be classified because it all traces back to Vice President Nixon, the CIA, and the 5412 committee. There's your immunity. And you know the story. Nixon goes to Howard Hughes, presents him with this opportunity to create this assassination team so he can win the 60 election. Hughes goes to Mayhew, his attorney. Mayhew goes to Johnny Rosselli, his contact in organized crime. They realize it's going to have the Cubans who do it. The best Cubans live in Miami. They all work for Santos Traficante. So they're going to have to go through organized crime, whom they're already working with prior to this with Operation Mongoose and 40. At that time, it's Operation 40. Anyway, Rosselli, who is the liaison between organized crime and the CIA, sets up a meeting. They have that famous meeting at the Fontainebleau, during which, first of all, he meets with his boss, Sam Giancana. So if you head down south in this graph, you'll see Sam Giancana at the bottom. That's his first contact with a mafia boss to explain to him the plan that Nixon has that has been communicated through Howard Hughes and Robert Mayhew, now to Rosselli. Rosselli is now transmitting that request to Sam Giancana. Now, Sam Giancana realizes, well, we're going to have to get those Miami people are Santos people. So we're going to have to get Santos on board. And uh, that's what I want to focus on next is Santos Trafficante. This is why I included Sheffield Edwards' name right under Nixon. Sheffield Edwards was Nixon's messenger boy. He was necessary to this all working out. So when they actually have the meeting at Fontainebleau, it's Sheffield Edwards, who's the director of security, the head of security at CIA, who arrives at that meeting as a representative of Vice President Nixon to convince Santos Trafficante that this is all coming from Vice President Nixon, who everyone assumes at that time is going to be the next president. So once Santos sees Sheffield Edwards, and of course, at this meeting, you've got Carlos Marcello, the top there. He's involved. The only one who's not at that meeting is Jimmy Hoffa. He'll get roped into it by these three later and become part of this plot, as we learn from Frank Regano, his attorney. And of course, he has extremely tight relations with Marcello and Trafficante and Giancana. So Jimmy Hoffa is kind of like his own mafia boss. He runs the Teamsters, but he has his own motives to want to participate in this plot, namely Bobby Kennedy. But let's talk about Santos Trafficante because he's the guy who has control over these Miami Cubans. And so he's the recruit that Sam Giancana needs to get into the fold. Now that Sheffield Edwards has appeared on the scene, Santos is convinced, so he creates the S-Force, named after Santos. Some of the most prominent members of the S-Force, you see the top arrow goes to William Harvey, who's involved in the S-Force, and we know he's involved in the S-Force because he actually wrote memos and signed them with his own name, talking about the S-Force during its period of training. So he's fully aware. Of course, anything assassination related to CIA, Harvey's got his fingerprints all over it. We know E. Howard Hunt was involved in the CIA. He actually ran one of the bases, I think it was Swan Island, where they trained these mechanics, these Cubans are being trained as assassins. So did Frank Sturgis. He had another base. Or E. Howard Hunt. It was E. Howard Hunt had a base, Frank Sturgis had a base, and then Tosh Plumley was the pilot who flew him around, eventually flying him across the border to Mexico to Clint Murchison's ranch where they trained. And the trainers were CIA, Carl Jenkins and William Rip Robertson, both trainers, fully vested CIA employees. And then, of course, Clint Murchison, who's linked to LBJ, Texas Oil, a big supporter of LBJ, is the ranch where they're doing all the training, out of the way so people can't see them. This is the ranch to it. This is the scenario that we learned about from the Nixon Watergate tapes when he talked about Mexico City and the activity further south of the border that could get everybody in trouble. So now look at who among those names we just listed ended up in Dallas on the day JFK was shot. E. Howard Hunt was there. Frank Sturgis was there. Tosh Plumley flew Sam Giancana in, flew Johnny Rosselli in, and was waiting at the airfield to fly him back out. So we know he was there. William Rip Robertson, many witnesses saw William Rip Robertson amongst the crowd doing what, who knows, but he was there in Dallas. And Clint Murchison, we know, was there because his big home was there, and they had a party the night before at his estate. They were all in Dallas. So now we go up to Carlos, or let's go back down to Sam Giancana. Who else was in Dallas on that day? Were any of Sam's people? We know Santos' people were there. The S-Force was there. How about Sam's people? Well, we know Charles Nicoletti and Johnny Rosselli were there because Tosh Plumley flew Johnny Rosselli in to serve as a spotter for Charles Nicoletti, who was a shooter in the Dell Techs building. And I believe, many people don't, they disagree with me, I believe James Files was the shooter on the grassy knoll behind the picket fence. He's Chicago. He's an assassin for Sam Giancana's outfit. And then Jack Ruby was sent to Dallas from Chicago by the Giancana outfit to do what he did, creating nightclubs, creating a presence there. And he is obviously in Dallas because he's the one that kills Lee Harvey Oswald 2 days later. Is everywhere on the whole weekend. These are all Chicago people. So we have two families represented prominently. Santos through the S Force that he created, all at the behest of Nixon and the 5412 Committee, and Sam Giancana, who recruited Santos into the plot. And Sam Giancana brought his people, his best people. Charles Nicoletti as an assassin for his organization. James Files was an assassin. James Files had all kinds of special skills they learned when he was in the military, and he got recruited into Sam Giancana's outfit when he returned to Chicago after the war because of those special skills. So Sam Giancana himself was in Dallas on that day, flown in also by Tosh Plumlee. Everyone's in Dallas. I mean, this is the place to be. It's Grand Central Station. Then you go up to the top of the graph, you have Carlos Marcello, who is involved in the plot. His is a little bit different role to the extent that I understand it. His job was to supervise the New Orleans sheep dipping and the whole summer of '63 operation with Oswald. And so he, in large part, because he controlled New Orleans, whatever happened in New Orleans had to have Carlos Marcello's blessing, helped put together this New Orleans crew. Got Clay Shaw. Well, first, David Atlee Phillips, who's responsible for the sheep dipping of Oswald, and enlists the help of Clay Shaw and Guy Bannister and David Ferry. And of course, Oswald is there. These are all CIA people, every last one of them. Oswald ends up in Dallas. David Ferry doesn't end up in Dallas. He ends up in Houston. Many people suspect he was the getaway pilot. Didn't work out, but he did go to Houston that night. And of course, David Atlee Phillips was in Dallas, not on that day. I probably shouldn't have put that word up. I shouldn't have put that up there because he was actually seen in Dallas by witnesses a couple days prior speaking with Lee Harvey Oswald. I haven't seen any evidence that he was actually there on that day, but everybody else was. Everybody else was. So you see the flow chart and how this all works. Nixon starts the process. It always starts with a word, right? The Joint Chiefs came to Ed Lansdale and got the ball rolling there. And then with the CIA, it was Dulles getting the ball rolling. Here with organized crime, it was Nixon getting the ball rolling, going through these people. Eventually, with Johnny Rosselli bringing in the three crime family heads, Carlos Marcello, Santos Trafficante, Sam Giancana. Of course, Santos was the most important because he had control of the Miami Cubans. Through Hitch, once they reassured Santos, he created this S Force, which he smartly recruited back as old Operation 40 soldiers to be on this S Force, so that if they got burned or the operation went bad, the CIA would cover for them because they were technically CIA employees now. There's zero immunity. Sam Giancana was involved with his people from Chicago. Carlos Marcello handled his part in the summer of '63 in New Orleans, and Jimmy Hoffa carried out his part. Now, Hoffa, by the time the assassination happens, sitting in a jail cell. I include him because he is all over wiretaps talking with Marcello and Trafficante and Giancana through his attorney, Frank Regano. My understanding of Jimmy Hoffa's role was more of a payment, a monetary role. For example, Jack Ruby was paid in Chicago from money that came from the Teamsters and Jimmy Hoffa. So for the role that Jack Ruby played, I possibly could have put Jimmy Hoffa's name down there by Sam Giancana instead of the top, because he was part and parcel with the Chicago crew that was paying Jack Ruby to get rid of the patsy after the assassination. So you just see all of these people what are the odds all these people would be in Dallas on this day? How about the payoffs for organized crime and organized labor? Well, the Justice Department harassment went away. Carlos Marcellus said, if you cut off the head, the tail ceases to be a problem. The head was Jack, the tail was Bobby, and the tail ceased to be a problem after Jack was assassinated. Hoover was appointed FBI director for life. This was a real payoff to organized crime because he didn't even want to admit there was such a thing as Cosa Nostra. And he had his own complicated, compromising connections to organized crime to protect. Kennedy's back channel with Cuba ended, which really wasn't a big deal to the organized crime in the sense that they cared whether or not we had peaceful relations with Cuba. All they cared about was getting access back into Cuba. And the fact is, Kennedy had given up on carrying out his part of the promise, the deal that he had made to get rid of Castro. Now he's trying to make peace with Castro. So getting rid of Kennedy opened the door for 5 years later to be replaced by Nixon. If Kennedy wins a second term, good chance Bobby Kennedy succeeds him. Getting rid of Kennedy foreclosed on that, and now Nixon, somebody else they control, is back in charge, and the anti-Castro efforts can resume. Nixon eventually pardons Jimmy Hoffa, courtesy of a $500,000 donation to Nixon's presidential campaign. And the vendetta, the Sicilian vendetta, is fulfilled. The Kennedys double-crossed organized crime. Organized crime took care of them and got its revenge for the double cross. How about the anti-Castroite Cubans? Notice again who's at the top of both flowcharts. You've got the CIA at the top. And that's your immunity. So anything underneath the CIA is going to be hidden because the CIA, it all leads back to the CIA, and they're not going to permit that. And of course, who's sitting on the Warren Commission but Alan Dulles, filtering out all this? Let's look at the right column first. Underneath the CIA there, you've got Frank Fiorini, which we know him as Sturgis. He's Cuban. Fiorini is his real name. And Santos Trafficante. Fiorini plays a real important role as a liaison between the CIA and Santos Trafficante. And whenever they need Santos' help with something, they go through Frank Fiorini. Of course, Frank Fiorini ends up being a primary player in whatever operation they're doing. Always does. He's neck deep in all this anti-Castro stuff. And so at this time, this is when Nixon's still vice president, and then early in Kennedy's tenure, in Operations 40 and Mongoose, and they needed Santos men, as we described earlier. You're going to have Cubans to be able to infiltrate into Cuba and make the anti-Castro operations look homegrown, look like they're grassroots or they're organic in nature. Can't have any ties back to the United States. Can't have white people doing this. As a result of Operations 40 and later Mongoose, the CIA creates a whole series of anti-Castro Cuban front groups, all based out of Miami. I've got 6 listed here. There's more. I just ran out of room. You got Alpha 66, which is the most famous, and this is the most hostile, the most violent, led by Antonio Veciano, Tony Cuesto, Eddie Bayo. And their stated purpose, according to Richard K. Snagel, was to assassinate Kennedy by the time we get to 63 and set up Oswald to be the patsy. So then you have the DRE led by Manuel Salvat. You get the MRR led by Manuel Artime and Tony Verona. You got Judge, JDGE, led by Carlos Prio. He used to be the president of Cuba, stole a bunch of money, was able to finance a lot of these anti-Castro deals. Jure, led by Manolo Rey, and the CRC. Now, the CRC is probably second in terms of notoriety to Alpha 66 because from the CRC came the Cuban Brigade, which was used in the Bay of Pigs operation. And I've got some of the Bay of Pigs people listed. Captain Eduardo Ferrer. We talked about Ruben Carvajal, who was really good friends with David Morales. We talked about Homer Echevarria, who was caught on FBI wiretaps, saying Kennedy's going to get his. And then Nestor Castellanos, another former Cuban brigade member who predicted that Kennedy was going to be taken care of on November 22nd in Dallas. These were all caught on wiretaps by the FBI. So the FBI knew in advance what was fixing to happen. And these are people being paid by the CIA, ultimately, when you trace all the money back. Now, it's being run through all these front companies and this and that, it's being laundered. But ultimately, that's where the money and the financing for all this is coming from. And when Operation Mongoose gets shut down by Kennedy, these people turn on Kennedy. And that's when Alpha 66 begins planning to kill Kennedy. And Richard Case Nagel infiltrates, as does Oswald. And that's when the CRC, or Cuban Brigade members, everybody in the Cuban community, anti-Castro Cuban community, knew what was happening. And they're telling FBI informants, they're caught on FBI wiretaps, all saying, Kennedy's going to die. Kennedy's going to die. And all of this toxic brew of anti-Castro organizations and people, and all these fanatics know what's fixing to go down. And all traced back to the CIA. Now let's look at the left column. This is when the CIA, through Nixon, the 5412 Committee, Howard Hughes, and all those, decided to set up a separate assassination team, not just to sabotage Cuba, not just to rat fuck Castro's government, which is what Operation 40 and Mongoose was doing, but to assassinate him. And that's when they create the S-Force. And of course, again, Frank Fiorini is prominently involved in this. He's one of Santos' men, but he's also CIA. And he is the liaison between these two organizations. He ends up running one of these training bases for the S-Force. And according to witnesses, and one in particular I want to mention, Fabian Escalante, who was the security director for Castro, his job was to keep Castro alive. He did his own investigation of the JFK assassination afterwards, and he named names. He said Frank Fiorini was in Dallas involved. Eladio Del Val was a shooter. Herminio Diaz was a shooter. These are S-Force members that were recruited, paid by the CIA. And this whole S-Force was put together by Richard Nixon, the sitting vice president of the United States at the time. This is why Nixon panicked in 72 when the Watergate burglars were arrested, because Frank Fiorini, or Frank Sturgis, was one that was arrested. E. Howard Hunt was arrested, and he knew he was part of the S-Force. He was also, like Sturgis, a trainer at one of the bases. And there were others that were arrested that were all part of this S-Force. And he knew where it would lead. If anyone ever thinks to look at this far and dig into this, it's all going to lead back to this S-Force that I started, that I created. E. Howard Hunt being the key. We cannot let the FBI go down there snooping around Mexico City about that check, finding out about what that money's paying for, and that training base down further south of the border. All these Bay of Pigs guys that was code for JFK assassination guys. And my goodness, it all leads back to the CIA, which is where all of these people and these organizations get their immunity. They're acting on behalf of the US government, ultimately against another part of the US government, the head of the US government. So what's the payoff for the anti-Castro Cubans? Pretty simple. Revenge for the betrayals. And instead of getting rid of Castro, he's now making peace with Castro. The return to normalcy, so to speak, which is a state of hostility between our government, Castro's government, and ultimately a replacement of JFK with 5 years later with Richard Nixon, somebody who was loyal to the cause. All right, how about the Secret Service? Here's your immunity right up front. LBJ, who appoints the Warren Commission. So anything anybody does further down this flowchart line is going to be guaranteed immunity because of what it leads back to, LBJ and the Warren Commission. LBJ, as we said in one of the earlier slides, got the word from J. Edgar Hoover, his buddy. They need to rope the Secret Service in. So he goes to his buddy, James Rowley, and look at the actions that James Rowley takes. He immediately puts Gerald Benn and Floyd Boring on vacation, straight shooters, replaces Gerald Benn with Roy Kellerman, who's technically in charge of Dallas, but not really from a practical standpoint. Gets rid of the driver, Thomas Shipman. Thomas Shipman, there's only three scenarios. Either he didn't know, in which case there's no reason to get rid of him, or he did know and he said, I'm not going to participate, in which case there is a reason to get rid of him, or he was a dirty cop, in which case there was no reason to get rid of him, just put him down in Dallas and he'd do exactly what William Greer did. The only one of those scenarios that makes sense is that he knew the plot and he wasn't going to go along with it. So 1 month before the trip to Dallas, he dies suspiciously. And he's replaced by William Greer, who ends up in Dallas. You can see Kellerman ends up in Dallas instead of Gerald Benn or Floyd Boring. William Greer ends up in Dallas, both in the front seat of the limo that the president's riding in, and neither one does anything remotely resembling their responsibilities or their protocols they're supposed to follow as being in charge of that limo. They didn't do anything. You can't say they did their job badly. They didn't do it at all. The next thing that James Rowley is in charge of is transferring out the experienced White House detail and replacing it with inexperienced replacements. 11 guys. There were only 12 total. He changed out 11 guys. Then he's part of the decision. You know, the White House wanted to end up at the Women's Museum to speak because it was a defendable building. Rowley, working together with the governor of the state, Connolly, convinces the White House to end up at the Trade Mart, which is where, you know, completely undefendable. I showed you a picture of all the catwalks and all the doors and entry points. And so if they didn't get him at Dealey Plaza, they would have got him at the Trade Mart. He's also in charge of other personnel, such as sending Thomas Kelly, who ends up in Dallas on that day, to be the cleaner of any loose ends. And of course, Thomas Kelly uses his thug, Elmer Moore, who ends up in Dallas on that day, to confiscate photos, bully Parkland doctors, remove JFK's body in the limo, destroy evidence like clothing, and dispose of Richard Douglas Chuck Robertson, another Secret Service agent who got wind of the plot and tried to stop it. So far now we have two Secret Service agents who proved to be straight arrows that are disposed of. You know, Richard Douglas Chuck Robertson, nobody knows what happened to him. He just disappeared. His family continued to get paychecks in the mailbox from the Secret Service, but their dad and their husband was gone. And there's evidence from witnesses of him running out into the street trying to stop the motorcade, telling what's fixing to happen. And he was wrestled to the ground, hustled away, and disappeared. And so that's Thomas, you know, Kelly's job is to clean up loose ends. Chuck Robertson became a loose end. He also served afterwards as the Warren Commission Secret Service liaison. He's the guy that determined what evidence was going to be given over to the Warren Commission in its investigation. So threat reports were omitted, previous motorcade reports, details of previous motorcades. None of that made it to the Warren Commission. So that the Secret Service just skates, and it's not until 15 years later in the House Select Committee that they start getting some of this information, that they chastise the Secret Service. They don't do anything to them. They said they were negligent in their duties. By that point, it's revealed that all of the officers that was there that day got promoted. They didn't get punished. They didn't get penalized. They didn't get fired. Nothing happened. They certainly didn't get prosecuted. They all got promoted. That's their immunity. James Rowley saw to it. And then, of course, Rowley also put Emory Roberts in charge of the Dallas, all the goings on in Dallas. And this is how we know that Roy Kellerman was in charge in name only. It was Emory Roberts calling the shots. He's the guy that worked with the mayor to get the motorcade route changed at the last minute, ordered Sam Kinney to remove the bubble top at the request of a LBJ aide, by the way. Waved off agents Ripka and Lawton, removing some of the security from the limo. They were supposed to ride on the running boards. He waved them off. He removed Godfrey McHugh from the front seat in the middle in the limo, opening up the field of fire, I swear, through the windshield. Removed the media flatbed truck, put it in the back, opened up the field of fire even more from the front. Removed the police motorcycles from the front and the side, opening up fields of fire from the front and the side. And ultimately, after the shooting started, gave the stand down order. Yelled at Reedy, who jumped off the running board of halfback, the Queen Mary, which was following the limo, started to run up to help with JFK, ordered him, said, get back, get back. And then got on the radio and told everybody else to stand down. That's exactly what happened. Everybody stood down. So we spent a couple of episodes talking about how do you corrupt the Secret Service. All you got to do is get a few pivotal people in charge corrupted, and then replace all the experienced with inexperienced people. They're going to take your orders. So you're talking about James Rowley, Thomas Kelly, and Emory Roberts, and possibly Kellerman and Greer. And they're the Secret Service, the elite guard for JFK is completely compromised. He has no idea he's being led like a lamb to the slaughter into a kill zone between 3 teams of rifles. He's no idea. No protection. I have at the bottom another Secret Service agent, Abraham Bolden, who tried, like the other two, or like Chuck Robertson, tried to reveal what he knew to the Warren Commission, volunteered to testify. Well, they took care of him right quick, charged him with a crime, concocted a whole scenario, sent him to prison, tried to kill him with drugs, psychedelics, and tried to drive him insane. That probably would have worked, except Jim Garrison got wind of it, went down and did a press conference, created a public spectacle, putting all kinds of pressure on the Secret Service and the judicial system to release him, because the whole thing was a setup. So here you see, and of course, James Rowley pulled all those strings. And James Rowley had immunity, and all these people under him doing what he's ordering them to do had immunity because it was LBJ, his friend, who's appointing the Warren Commission. So here you see 3 Secret Service agents who had to be disposed of. They probably would have killed all 3, but Abraham Bolden, by the time his story goes public, has too much light on him. So they tried to ruin him and tried to kill his wife, bomb the house, bomb the car, tried to kill Bolden with drugs. Bolden is just tough. His wife was just tough. They just hung in there and hung in there and hung in there. And so far as I know, he's still alive. But Thomas Shipman and Chuck Robertson are dead. And so that's the flow chart and the immunity for the Secret Service. What were the payoffs for the Secret Service? Why would they go along with this? Well, they thought JFK was a moral degenerate, and they would know. They were close to him. They had to protect him. They had to keep things discreet. And they thought he was a moral degenerate. They didn't like his position with respect to communism. They thought he was soft. And they didn't think he was strong enough to stand up. And the fact that he was a moral degenerate, how naturally he must be a traitor as well. And they especially hated his civil rights stance. That was the big one. That was the one they couldn't stand. He was a crusader for civil rights by the time we get to 63. And he's giving speeches about this is going to be this is the moral issue of our time. This is going to be one of my pressing issues going forward, along with nuclear disarmament. And these guys are all Southern redneck hillbillies. They hated Bolden. They hated Kennedy. Well, now the guy they like, the guy they're loyal to, is the new president, and he's not a moral degenerate. If you know anything about LBJ, to say he's not a moral degenerate is like saying that the moon is made out of green cheese or something. But look how these conspirators, these guys that were corrupted in the higher ranks of the Secret Service, got rewarded. Rowley became LBJ's personal protector, never left his side for the next 5 years, Kelly serves as the Secret Service liaison at the Warren Commission, gets a promotion, and Roberts gets promoted to LBJ's personal secretary. And I think LBJ understood these Secret Service guys can be corrupted because I corrupted them to get Kennedy out of the way. They could possibly be corrupted against me at some point. So it's that old Michael Corleone thing about keep your enemies your friends close and your enemies closer. All right, what about LBJ? All right, this is the one. This is the big enchilada here. Obviously, immunity for LBJ is not going to be a problem. He's going to be the new president. And of course, the guy in charge of the FBI is his friend, J. Edgar Hoover. He's given all the evidence to the Warren Commission. And of course, LBJ is going to pick the Warren Commission. So, in several different ways, LBJ is immunized. Obviously, LBJ ends up in Dallas on that day, as does J. Edgar Hoover. Both. J. Edgar Hoover was bulldog at that party at the Murchison estate the night before. And LBJ had some close friends, and some pretty powerful people, moneyed people. They called it the Suite 8F gang because they met in this building, in this suite 8F. And this is where they had their little meetings to plot their little kingdoms. And it was led by LBJ's personal attorney, who pretty much was the consigliere. He was the fixer for LBJ, going from the beginning of LBJ's career to the end. His name was Ed Clark. And included in that Suite 8F group was Clint Murchison Jr., who we know was in Dallas that weekend. H.L. Hunt, these are oil guys. He was in Dallas at that party. Sid Richardson, oil guy. Harold Dryholes owned the Texas School Book Depository, oil guy. And John Connally, obviously, the governor. He was sort of the protege of LBJ. And he was his power, and he was his rep back in Austin while LBJ was away in Washington. John Connally ran things for him politically. And of course, he was in Dallas that day. Became a victim, but he was in Dallas nevertheless. All right, so you had that Suite 8F group. This is going to be a group that's prominent in this assassination because of the money that they can provide. For example, according to Barr McClellan, who was in Ed Clark's law firm and wrote a book later detailing the extent of the plot and how it worked, he said that Ed Clark charged $2 million for this plot to kill Kennedy. The work that he had to do, his role in it, he charged $2 million, and that money came from Murchison, Hunt, Richardson, and Byrd. That's where he got the money. That's how he got paid. Another friend, or I wouldn't call him a friend, but he was LBJ's hired hand, was Malcolm Mac Wallace, who was his personal hitman. We know he was in Dallas on that day because his fingerprint was found in the sniper's nest on a box. And according to Barr McClellan, Ed Clark, this is going down near the bottom of the flow chart, had in his employ in this plot to kill the president, John Cofer, Clifton Carter, and Malcolm Wallace. Cofer, an attorney. Carter was an attorney for LBJ, handled a lot of the dirty work. We know he was in Dallas. He was photographed on Air Force One after LBJ took the oath. And of course, Malcolm Mac Wallace was in Dallas, we know, and his job was to, according to Barr McClellan, recruit Jack Ruby and Lee Harvey Oswald into the plot, both of whom were also in Dallas on that day. Now, this is substantiated by Billy Celestis, who later, and this was one of the cronies that LBJ had, or they had this scheme to make all this money, and he was eventually caught by the Justice Department, and he eventually was going to go to prison for a long time, but he turned state's evidence. And part of the state's evidence that he turned over or testified to was that there was this plot led by Ed Clark at the behest of LBJ to make LBJ president because he had so many legal problems. And he was, JFK had already indicated he wasn't going to put him on the ticket in 64. It had to happen quick. He was going to go to jail. And so Ed Clark was put in charge, and he used his attorneys, Clifton Carr, Mac Wallace, and all the people in the 8F crew to put together this Dallas. This is why it had to happen in Dallas, in Texas, had to happen in Texas. And according to Bar McClellan and Billy Celestis, Mac Wallace knew Jack Ruby, knew Lee Harvey Oswald, recruited both of them into this plot. I don't know to what extent he recruited Ruby and Oswald into this plot. I know they were both in Dallas, and I know they were both involved. I don't know if it was Mac Wallace who recruited them into it, because they have so many other ties with CIA, with organized crime, et cetera, et cetera. Nevertheless, this is what Bar McClellan, who was on the inside, said. This is what Billy Celestis said. Look at all these people end up in Dallas. LBJ's in Dallas, J. Edgar Hoover's in Dallas, Mac Wallace is in Dallas, Clifton Carter is in Dallas, Jack Ruby's in Dallas, Oswald's in Dallas, John Connolly's in Dallas, Hunt's in Dallas, Murchison's in Dallas. My goodness. All right, what are the payoffs for LBJ? And I've highlighted his name, but look at all the payoffs that having LBJ as part of the plot guarantees for everybody else. Like, for example, if you look at the deep state in the first column, National Security Action Memo 273 has to be signed by a president. And that's what they need to greenlight the process heading towards the Vietnam War, because they're currently operating under National Security Action Memo 263, which is closing down the war. So 273 reverses that. Of course, LBJ signs that 4 days after the assassination, which means the Vietnam War, the Cold War, and all the back channels are ended. So that, what a payoff to the deep state, to the CIA, and to the Pentagon. How about the Texas oilmen? The people that paid $2 million to Ed Clark for his role in the plot and paid for basically LBJ's entire political career, were paid off handsomely when the oil depletion allowance, which Kennedy was going to cut in half, costing billions of dollars to the oilmen. LBJ immediately freezes it at 27.5%, which is what it always had been, saving the oilmen billions of dollars, literally billions of dollars. Huge payoff. How about the Cuban Americans? Vengeance, and 5 years later, Nixon. How about the mafia? Vengeance, vendetta, but also, more importantly, the end of the Justice Department jihad against all things organized crime related. Now, they don't get back into Cuba, but they didn't know that at the time. They knew with JFK they weren't getting back into Cuba. At least with LBJ and then Nixon 5 years down the road, they had a chance. And of course, Jimmy Hoffa, if you want to include organized labor, got released from jail by Nixon. Obviously, with LBJ, all of his legal issues go away instantly. The Senate was looking into Bobby Baker. The Justice Department was looking into Billy Estes. He was on the verge of being indicted. He would have gone to jail. There's just no ifs, ands, or buts. The evidence was overwhelming. On the very day JFK was assassinated, the Senate was holding hearings about the Bobby Baker scandal. He was calling back and forth to Washington to get updates. And as soon as the assassination happened, the Senate closed down their hearings and the Justice Department closed the case. All his legal issues vanished, and his ultimate dream to become president was realized. Remember that when he took the vice presidency and he said, "I'm a betting man. 1 out of every 4 presidents dies in office. I like my odds. Power is where power goes." How about the Secret Service? Well, we just went through the payoffs there, so I don't have to rehash that. But LBJ is the central player in all this. He's the key figure. Now, I wanted to consider a few other additional questions, because in the late 70s, the House Select Committee produces a report that says that JFK did die as a result of conspiracy, but they didn't go where I'm going. They went to the mafia, and they said that the mafia worked together with Oswald to assassinate Kennedy. And they're very careful. Of course, you remember when the House Select Committee was put together originally, Ed Sprague was leading it, and he was going after the CIA. That was the direction he was headed immediately, and they got him gone. They pulled that personnel thing where you want to rig something, you pick carefully who's in charge of it. And that's how you rig it. Once they realized Ed Sprague's direction, they got rid of it and they caused a fake scandal, got rid of him. Next thing you know, he's been replaced by Blakey, and Blakey's made his whole prosecutorial reputation on prosecuting the mob, which this is sort of a limited hangout. They're saying, okay, we're probably going to have to admit that there's a conspiracy because there's enough evidence now to show that there's certainly a conspiracy, but we're not going to let it touch the CIA or the FBI or the military or LBJ or the Secret Service. We're going to restrict it to the mob. So Blakey's the perfect person. And of course, Oswald, he's dead. He can't defend himself. So that's exactly what happened. So people quote the House Select Committee so much because it's the last investigation officially where the government did, and they give it credit. And they say, well, it said a conspiracy. And that is a half step. I mean, that's a step in the right direction, but it's the wrong direction. The mafia, as we just learned, was part of it, but they could not do some things. They could not. Well, let me just ask some of these questions and you'll see what I mean. Could the mafia change the parade route to bring it next to the Texas School Book Depository where you have the patsy set up to take the fall? Can Anthony, Fat Tony, Salerno get the motorcade route changed? Could Tony, Big Tuna, Accardo get the motorcade route changed? Or is this a function of the Secret Service and the CIA and the mayor and all the deep state politicians? I mean, you tell me. Was it organized crime that sheep-dipped Oswald all summer of '63, or was it Guy Bannister, veteran of naval intelligence, the FBI, and the CIA? And of course, Guy Bannister was doing what David Atlee Phillips ordered him to do. Was Oswald working out of a mafia joint all that summer? In other words, for Carlos Marcello, was he working for Carlos Marcello, or was he working out of Guy Bannister's office, along with other CIA guys like Ferry, Clay Shaw, and all of these Operation Mongoose Cubans? You see where I'm going with this? The mafia couldn't do any of those things. Could organized crime have leveraged the FBI and CIA into only giving the Warren Commission evidence that pointed to a lone gunman, rigged evidence? Could the organized crime have determined who was going to serve on the Warren Commission, rigging it right from the outset? Could organized crime change the motorcade route at all, determine any part of its path? Could it remove the bubble top? Could it scrub the crime scene? Could it steal JFK's body? Could it rig the autopsy? Could it plant, suppress, disappear, alter, manufacture, whatever you want to call it, all this evidence that we've learned to this point? The answer is no, 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 and no. It couldn't do any of that. So you have to conclude that though the House Select Committee said Carlos Marcello, Jimmy Hoffa, Sam Giancana, Santos Trapicani had the means and the opportunity and obviously the motive to kill JFK. I agree. They did have the motive. I agree. They had the means and the opportunity. But it was part of the plot. It wasn't the conspirator that worked with Oswald to kill Kennedy. It was one of five. And it was not the most important one of five. It was used. It was useful. They were useful instruments. All right. So I want to conclude with a quick look at some known and unknown domestic intelligence. Now that we've determined the CIA is really at the epicenter of all these conspirators, you look at the CIA and how it maneuvered the Cubans around. You look at the CIA and how it brought organized crime into it. Obviously, the CIA used its own assets and ZR rifle. You look at the CIA, they're the first person the Joint Chiefs contacted to participate in this. The CIA is front and center in the strategy, and that's always their role. So we want to look at, the CIA is not supposed to operate domestically. And what we're going to see is that it's been, not only is, it has been for a long time. violating its charter, operating domestically. These are known. Okay, these are not unknown or we're still trying to figure it out. These are known CIA operations, and I would include the FBI. The FBI is part of the intelligence community, so one of these ties directly back to the FBI. MK Ultra started in 53, operated through 73. I won't describe all these in great detail. MK Ultra was the mind control program where they were experimenting on U.S. citizens. They ran out of Koreans and eventually Vietnamese, and so they started experimenting on U.S. prisoners, inmates, college students, different, even veterans, military personnel, unwittingly, and trying to use, basically a cocktail of drugs and hypnosis to program people into doing things they didn't want to do and not have any memory of it afterwards. We know for a fact that this operation was operating domestically for those 20 years. We know for a fact Operation Mockingbird, which is capture of the media, infiltration of the media with CIA and agency spooks to get the word out and to always slant the news in the CIA's favor. That's the only one that doesn't have a termination date. In other words, it's ongoing. That started in 57. By the way, that was led by that Cord Meyer fellow. He was put in charge of that. The JFK assassination, which I included in the known category because I think it's patently obvious. This was an Operation Northwoods. You attack a prominent American target and blame it on a foreign enemy, which is false flag. That's what it was. It was classically a Northwoods false flag. That's what it was. 1967, it ran an operation against the Clay Shaw or the Jim Garrison DA's office, infiltrating and rat fucking it from within. In 68, it was the MLK assassination. Now, this was not the CIA. This was the FBI. In fact, in the 90s, the King family sued the city of Memphis and the FBI, and the jury came back and concluded that the FBI killed Martin Luther King. That's a jury of our peers who concluded it's kind of like the Marita Lorenz deal, where the Liberty Lobby lawsuit, where the jury concluded based on Marita Lorenz's testimony that E. Howard Hunt, the CIA, killed President Kennedy. We have two jury trials establish after hearing the evidence that Martin Luther King and JFK were killed, one by the FBI and one by the CIA. The RFK assassination in 68, which we now know was accomplished by a CIA plant to serve on RFK's security detail. There we go again, compromising the Secret Service, compromising, in this case, the security detail around RFK. The guy's name was Thane Eugene Caesar, shot Kennedy right behind his right ear, so close that left powder burns on his skin. The autopsy determined that was the cause of death. Sirhan, the guy was still rotting in a jail cell, the diversion, the Lee Harvey Oswald of the plot, the James Earl Ray of the plot, the diversion, the patsy, is still sitting in a California jail for the crime because it was a rigged trial to let the CIA escape. By the way, Thane Eugene Caesar just recently died. Watergate was a CIA operation to get rid of Nixon for the same reason they got rid of Kennedy 9 years prior. He was trying to make peace with the Russians. Infiltrated his White House. They ran the taping system, infiltrated Creep headquarters, the committee to reelect, and they infiltrated the plumbers. And then they fed all their news through they got all their tips from these two deep throat plants, which fed the news to the Office of Naval Intelligence officer, veteran, a newspaper reporter by the name of Bob Woodward, who wrote for the Washington Post. He was naval intelligence. And boom, there's the story. you don't have to always assassinate somebody. You can embroil them in a legal situation and force them to resign, threaten with impeachment. And then, of course, they tried to rat fuck the House Select Committee assassination in '78 by planting George Joannides inside, and he became the filter. First of all, they got rid of Ed Sprague and replaced him with a mafia guy. And then they put George Joannides inside to filter all the evidence. You know, he'd been down in Miami at JM Wave, basically involved in all the deep sheep dipping and of Lee Harvey Oswald and his anti-Cuban stuff and his pro-Cuban. He'd been involved with Lee Harvey Oswald along with David Atlee Phillips from the beginning. They just didn't tell the House Select Committee that, they didn't tell Blakey that. And so he knew what evidence needed to be filtered out and what evidence could be allowed to filter through. And they completely rat fucked the whole committee, the findings. Blakey didn't find out till years later, and he was furious. Now he says, I won't believe anything the CIA tells me. They screwed up our whole investigation, and they did it on purpose while lying to me constantly to my face. I also have some unknown. Whether or not these are domestic intelligence community operations, we don't know. I suspect that they were. Ruby Ridge in '92, Waco in '93, two operations against what the government determined were domestic threats because they were collecting weapons for an Armageddon. One had a religious overtone to it, the Branch Davidians. They thought Armageddon was coming. They had a prophet who prophesied, and they were getting ready for that day. They weren't any threat to anybody. They were minding their own business. You can see what we did to them. And Ruby Ridge was a family who kind of lived as, they were like militia people. They lived off the grid. They had weapons, and we stormed the gates with the ATF. It turned into a battle between two sides. People got killed on both sides. It was a big mess. The reason I think these were intelligence operations is because one of the modus operandi, one of the purposes of all these operations domestically is to smear these groups and paint with a broad brush anybody who's anti-government as being these violent extremists. And it gives the government an excuse to term them domestic terrorists and go after them. It's kind of like what they do with Trump supporters now. Every Trump supporter is a borderline domestic terrorist. It gives the government a lot of latitude to go after them. And it smears the whole movement. Well, in '92 and '93, the big movement was these survivalists, these people that hated the government and tried to live as far removed from the government and its reach as possible. And I don't have any proof that these are intelligence operations. I suspect that they were, so I labeled them as unknown. Here's another unknown couple, 9/11. You know, when 9/11 happened, I believed everything I was told. I was watching it live with my students. I saw the second plane hit the building. Then we heard about the Pentagon in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. It looked legitimate. And then you as you study all these things, you start to realize what happened next was the war on terror and the Patriot Act and all this surveillance of American citizens, this great expansion of government authority. And the precipitating event was this 9/11. And it makes you think, because you harken back in your mind, you've already learned that the Spanish-American War, the precipitating event was two things. It was this so-called letter from the Spanish ambassador called President McKinley, weak and stupid. It got printed by all our papers, infuriating American people. And then it was the sinking of the Maine, which we found out later in CIA's own documents, that was a false flag operation. We sunk our own boat. And the combination of those two things convinced the American people to go fight our first foreign war. And as a result of that, we got a taste, because we got Puerto Rico, we got Guam, we got the Philippines, we got a portion of Cuba. And wow, it's like candy. But it took that precipitating event to get us in that war. And then you fast forward to World War I, and you realize it was two events again, another letter and another boat. It was the German foreign minister who allegedly wrote a cable or a memo to Mexico, the Zimmerman note, offering them if Mexico would agree to help Germany fight America in World War One, they would get all of their territory back that the Americans stole from them, Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, et cetera, California. Well, that infuriated America. Again, it gets published in all the papers. Both cases, by the way, the German foreign minister denied writing that letter, that telegram, and the Spanish foreign ambassador also denied ever writing that letter. There's no proof. We don't have any proof that they wrote it, except that what we read in the papers. And then the boat was the Lusitania, which the Germans had warned, don't sail through these waters. We're going to sink everything. And we sailed anyway, under flags of neutral countries and transporting war materials in the bottom of these boats. And they sunk it, 1,300 souls lost. Next thing you know, World War One. Then you fast forward to World War II. What was the precipitating event? It was Pearl Harbor. Well, we now know that we had broken the Japanese code. We knew well in advance that they were planning to attack us. We didn't necessarily know where, but we knew they were coming to attack us. And we must have known where, because the night before we sailed out all of our aircraft carriers out of Pearl Harbor, out into the Pacific to protect them, because those were the important ships. We sacrificed all the battleships. The battleship was the war of the past. The aircraft carrier was the ship of the future. And how on earth, with radar and sonar, did all that convoy of ships and planes heading in the direction of Pearl Harbor go undetected when we had broken their code and we had all these technologies that would find ships and planes? I don't know, but that was the precipitating event that got us in World War II. Many people suspect that that was a false flag. So you start, and then you fast forward to Vietnam. We now know Gulf of Tonkin never happened. It was a complete fabrication, and it accomplished its purpose. So if you start putting it in the context of all that, Spanish-American War, World War I, World War II, Vietnam, and then you fast forward to 9/11, and you start asking questions. Was that another Operation Northwoods, attack an American target and blame a foreign enemy? Al-Qaeda, Afghanistan, the Taliban, and Iraq. Iraq didn't have anything to do with 9/11. Eventually, in 2003, we use another subterfuge called WMDs, and we send poor, pitiful Colin Powell to the UN. He's the only guy with any respect that the world will respect. Everybody else in that government, nobody respected. Everybody knew they were warmongers. Colin Powell was the man who didn't want to go to war, but even he is convinced with these vials that he's presenting to the UN Security Council that Saddam Hussein is trying to manufacture weapons of mass destruction. And that became the justification for our first preemptive war. And what was the CIA's role in that? Operation Mockingbird, captured media. The media ran with the story and just pounded the American people with story after. It was like the yellow press back during the Spanish-American days. It became fashionable for all the media outlets to jump on board with this war and push it until the American people finally came alongside and said, okay, we support it. So the question is, was 9/11 an Operation Northwoods with a false flag? With the end result being the war on terror, the Patriot Act, and the Department of Homeland Security. And if you look at I think it was building number 7 and how it collapsed, and you just look at the way the two Twin Towers collapsed. It looks like a demolition. And then you look at building number 7, which wasn't even impacted by any of the planes. Why did it collapse? And I don't know. I'm just asking questions. It's unknown. We don't know. By the way, this is why I'm having to put this episode today on Rumble, because YouTube would come find me and put me in the deepest hole they could find if I tried to put this on YouTube. So anyway, I'm not saying I know. I'm saying there's questions. And when you consider it in the context of other things that we do know, the trust factor, the government doesn't have the benefit of the doubt anymore. The intelligence community does not have the benefit of the doubt, not with me anyway. So that's what causes you to question. Maybe 20 years ago, well, I'm telling you, in 2001 when it happened, I didn't question it. It's only been because of what I've learned subsequent to that. Here's a known, because of Edward Snowden, even though the government lied, James Clapper, famously the director of national intelligence, went before Congress, lied his ass off, saying, no, we don't surveil anybody. We don't collect any data on American citizens. Edward Snowden that same year, this is 2013, said, yeah, you do. And the reason I know is because I'm the one doing it. Here's the documents. And we chased him right out of the country. He had to flee for his life. He's still living in Russia to this day. That's a known domestic surveillance intelligence operation. And I have a question mark on the termination date because as far as I know, it's still ongoing. How about Crossfire Hurricane 2016? It was decided by the intelligence community that Donald Trump could not be our president. Worked hand in hand with the DNC and Hillary Clinton to concoct a whole legend around Trump that he was in bed or colluding with Vladimir Putin and the Russians. Crossfire Hurricane, that's what they called it. Dogged him all the way through his presidency. They even got a special counsel appointed to investigate it. They knew there was no evidence of it. They'd made it up. They came up with this dossier from this intelligence asset over in England, and he funneled it. The DNC paid him for it, and he funneled it through the media, which once the media reported on it, FBI started investigating, opened a counterintelligence investigation, which then opened the door for a special counsel to investigate, made it all official. They took it through the right channels to release it to the American public and then investigate it. Found no evidence. The whole special counsel thing was a trap, trying to get Trump to somehow try to resist or obstruct justice, and then they could charge him with obstruction of justice. It was a sting. The whole thing was an intelligence operation. We know that now. We don't know about COVID. A lot of suspicion that COVID was a domestic operation to get rid of Trump and the lead up to the 2020 election. I'm not going to get into this too deep today because next week I'm going to do an entire episode on mass formation psychosis and the elements necessary for this. Is a psyop. This is psychological warfare. Intelligence community has used for years overseas to rig elections, to launch coups against governments, unfriendly governments, to depopularize certain movements that are gaining in popularity, whatever. Mass formation psychosis. Now, according to establishment scientists, there is no such thing as mass formation psychosis, which to me is like Alan Dulles saying Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone. There's no such thing as a conspiracy. As soon as I hear, oh no, mass formation psychosis doesn't exist, that's not a thing. My skepticism and cynicism wins the day, and I say, well, it must be. That sure sounds legitimate to me. Basically, it's accomplished through 4 measures: social isolation, which happened in COVID, obviously, hyper anxiety and irrational fear of dying, which obviously was a part of COVID, senseless and seemingly unexplainable events that don't seem to make sense and nobody can explain them to you, and a growing secularism or a disbelief in God. You know, back in the day when America was very religious, a Christian nation, so to speak, people believed that God was in control. And you either believe that or you don't. And even when things happen that you don't understand, a crisis happens, chaos, whatever, a pandemic, a war, you can ultimately, if you believe in God, say, well, God knew this was going to happen. This is not a surprise to God. And he's got the whole world in his hands. So he's got our country in his hands. He's got my family in his hands. He's got me in his hands. He's got everything under control. I'll just trust him. And so if a people, a nation collectively, in a majority sense, believes that way, they don't get rattled easily. They're rooted to this faith. But if there's a growing disbelief in God, people still have to believe in something. So what they do is they tend to replace that faith in God with a faith in their leaders and the institutions, in science. How many times did you hear trust the science? As if it's a fixed thing. There's a conclude. It's all been decided. Science, the way I've always been taught, is a process, and you're always learning new things, and it's always changing your view on things because you're learning that your knowledge base is always changing, and you're learning new things all the time. So you can't ever say with finality that you know everything. You never know everything. But they said trust the science. And meanwhile, they're telling us to do all these things that are patently ridiculous. We'll get into that next week. But if you can combine those four elements, then you can hypnotize a public to do just about anything you want. You can lead them to do anything you want them to do, which is oftentimes used to explain how in the world did Germans, who are some of the most advanced people in the world in the 30s and 40s with their technology and their scientific knowledge and their culture. And I mean, these were cutting edge, civilized people, and they got led around by the nose by Adolf Hitler. And the explanation is mass formation psychosis. You had all four of those elements at play after World War I in Germany, and people were looking for a strong man. There's a thought out there that Trump was such a threat. And they had already tried an operation in 2016 called Crossfire Hurricane. It didn't work. So they came up with one that did work using a health crisis, a manufactured health crisis that we now know was manufactured. Everything they told us was a lie. They said it came from a bat. We now know it came from a lab. It wasn't, they censored Trump when he said it was the China virus. It didn't come from China. It came from a bat. And it wasn't their fault. We now know it came from a lab in Wuhan, which is in China. They said, well, if you stay 6 feet away, you won't transmit it. If you wear a mask, the virus won't go through the mask. I mean, it's just one lie after another. They said we had nothing to do with this virus. It was a naturally occurring. Turns out it happened in a lab. And the US, we just learned this week, was paying for this gain of function research. In other words, we produced the COVID virus and released it strategically from China so that China would be blamed. And of course, China had a lot of motive to go along with this because no one was harder on China than Trump was with all the tariffs. And an election was coming up. And so one way to distort the election is to create a pandemic that forces social isolation. We cannot have people standing in long lines to vote. So for this election, purposes of this election, we'll have mail-in balloting, which we can't check people's voter registration cards or their licenses or their identities. So people will just have to trust that it is who they say they are. And we'll swamp the system with all these votes for whichever candidate is not named Trump. And then as soon as the election is over and we get the desired result, the pandemic will end. Tell me if any of that didn't happen. Now, again, it's important to note, this has not been proven. I don't know. Sure looks suspicious. Sure looks suspicious. And some of the things that were happening during those days, I remember, you see the sign here, stay home, help us save lives. Empty streets everywhere, except in the lead up to the election. In these big cities, protests everywhere. Black Lives Matter, Antifa, tens of thousands of people in the streets. That was okay. But we can't have people standing in line to vote. We can't have kids going to school. We'll close down all the small restaurants, all the small grocery stores. We'll leave open the big ones, Walmart, Costco, et cetera, et cetera. It goes to number 3, senseless and seemingly unexplainable events. So that was 2020. So we're getting closer to current day. How about the election itself? I've already kind of talked about that. How would an intelligence community participate beyond what we've already discussed with COVID. Well, how about censorship of stories that might hurt their candidate and shut down have a media blackout of any story that might hurt the candidate that they support. We all remember the story of Hunter Biden and the laptop. I don't really care about Hunter Biden. I couldn't give two flat nickels about Hunter Biden, but a lot of those emails in the Hunter laptop talked about the big guy and kicking all this money upstairs to the big guy. Who was the big guy? It would have been nice to be able to follow that through and learn before the election who the big guy was. Well, we now know who the big guy was because they have bank records. The big guy was his daddy. He's kicking millions and millions and millions of dollars up to his daddy from all these foreign governments. And Hunter Biden doesn't have any expertise in anything. It's just because they're buying access. He's selling his office. And of course, they came out, 51 spies wrote letters and said that all of that laptop was Russian disinformation. And so anyone who talked about it on Facebook was censored. Trump himself talked about it on Twitter. This is before Elon Musk, and they took him off Twitter. They banned him. They literally blacked out any bad news about Biden and his whole family criminal ties and tied Trump's hands behind his back so he couldn't say what he wanted to say and run for re-election. He basically won in 2016 because of Twitter. And they completely took that weapon away from him. I don't know if you've noticed, they're doing it to him again here in 2024. It's the same. They just, methods and sources, history repeats. They just do it again and again and again every time it's necessary. They wait until the strategic time, the year of the election, and then boom. This is trademark of the intelligence community. In 1963, they said, it's J. Edgar Hoover, there's no such thing as a mafia, which was a lie to cover for himself and for the connections between the mafia and CIA and intelligence community. In 2023, they say there's no such thing as a deep state. I think I've said this on a couple podcasts before. I don't believe anything. They get these CIA experts on TV and they make these grandiose statements. I don't believe anything they say. If you're in the CIA, you are trained to lie. Your whole job as a spy is to deceive. You are a liar by occupation. That's, if you're any good at it, that's what you do. And you do it in such a way that it's believable. But after you've studied this long enough, it's no longer believable because it's the same lie over and over and over again. We now know that all 51 of these spies who wrote these letters and accusing the Russian laptop of being Russian disinformation, we now know that laptop was not Russian disinformation. It's accurate. It's legitimate. It's real. So they lied again. And same guy. Look at on the picture here. So spies who lie. You got John Brennan, who was the director of the CIA, and you got James Clapper. Same guy. He was one of. We shouldn't have listened to him for sure. It's already been established. He lied to Congress about surveillance, and now here he is, one of these intelligence experts who discredited the Hunter laptop, saying it was Russian disinformation. Same guy. He's made a career of lying, and we listened to him. Another unknown is, boy, 2020 was a busy year. That should tell you something. It was an election year. So you get the Governor Whitmer kidnapping, which turns into a false flag, Operation Northwoods by the FBI. You get the January 6th insurrection, which again turns into an Operation Northwoods false flag. Now, that's technically 2021. Now, these are unknown to the extent that it hasn't been proven yet, but that's the direction all the evidence is starting to point. That these were, just like Ruby Ridge and Waco, intended to smear Trump supporters, this reputation of being insurrectionists. And they choose that word strategically because it kicks into gear at certain legal remedies if you use that word. It's defined as an insurrection. I don't want to get too deep in all that. I'm just listing some things that people, some of them are known, some of them are unknown, but there's a lot of suspicion. And this is the major casualty of the JFK assassination, all the lies that emanated from it, people don't trust what they're told anymore. They don't trust the institutions. They don't trust the government because they've been lied to too many times. You know, what's that old saying? Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. There's always people out there that will believe just about anything. But if you've educated yourself to any degree at all, there has to be a healthy bit of skepticism. And that's the media's role, is to play that truth to power, speaking truth to power. But now we're in an age when most of the media is on the side of the government that's lying to us. And they're parroting that lie. Because why? Because in 1957, the CIA figured, boy, you know, one way to amplify our lies and to make it harder for the American people to learn the truth is to capture the media through Operation Mockingbird and make them our bitch. Basically, it's what they've done. Pardon my French, but and now they just repeat. You can't turn on a television show without seeing a former intelligence expert pontificating. James Clapper's all over television. All day yesterday, James Comey was on TV blasting Trump. He's the former director of the FBI. Brennan's on TV. Everywhere you look, former intelligence officials. Watch for that. When you're watching television and they announce someone who's going to give commentary on the news, look at what their expertise is, where they come from. A lot of them come from intelligence, former FBI, former CIA, former NSA, and that's that continuing Operation Mockingbird operation. All right, there is a line of demarcation that seems to have happened, and it's before Obama and after Obama. Until President Obama, the intelligence community mainly focused on foreign threats. And this was sort of a right-wing agenda to protect us from foreign enemies. After Obama, during Obama and after, the intelligence community began focusing mostly on domestic threats. We now know. We didn't know at the time. We now know because of the surveillance program and all the FISA court abuses and things. We now know, you know, like I remember when Obama was president, the IRS went after the Tea Party. Anybody who was Tea Party was a legitimate potential domestic terrorist. And boy, they had carte blanche to go after any of these conservative organizations, etc. You see, a day hardly goes by, the FBI is not chasing down somebody who went to a school board meeting or somebody who stood in front of an abortion clinic or somebody who, didn't use the right pronoun. What, I don't know. It's just the domestic operation, the targeting of domestic, the targeting of American citizens now is just rampant. And that capacity to do that happened in the aftermath of 9/11 with the passing in a Republican administration of the Patriot Act, creation of the Homeland Security Agency, a new cabinet level position, and all these new modern day surveillance technologies that exist. And that seemingly today, a lot of this targeting of domestic, quote, enemies of the state seems to be a left-leaning agenda going after conservatives. So it used to be a right-leaning agenda going after left causes from a foreign left-leaning causes. Now it is a domestic operation going after right-leaning causes, conservative causes. The line of demarcation seems to be President Obama's presidency. All right. So what could be done? You know, I read this years ago in David Talbot's book, Brothers, and he was talking mainly about in the context of the JFK assassination. And you can become overwhelmed by all this, and you can become depressed and kind of feel like things hopeless. So I don't want to leave us with that. I wanted to make sure and like David Talbot did, give some practical steps that could be taken that we should be demanding as American citizens to get to the truth, because I really feel like our country changed on November 22, 1963. Fundamentally, it changed. And we need to go back and pick that scab if we're going to go back and rekindle what made America great. And we can't ever do it with what we can't just paper it over and say, well, let's just let bygones be bygones and start over now. No, we got to go back to the moment when we started living a lie, and we need to pick that scab, learn the truth, and then work our way forward, learning all the new truths as we get closer to the current day, so that we can start fresh, but build on a solid foundation of truth, not lies. So here's just a couple steps. The U.S. government should release all the files, obviously, if we can get a president who won't fall under the spell of a CIA director. The CIA should release all travel and phone records of agents suspected of involvement in the JFK and RFK assassinations. Example, David Morales. That should have been done years ago. What point? They're all dead. What are you hiding? U.S. government should formally request all relevant secret files from Cuba, Mexico, and Russia. There's a lot of stuff in Mexico because David Atlee Phillips was head of he was station chief in Mexico City, and he was prominently involved in setting up Oswald. Cuba, obviously, with the security director down there for Castro, and obviously we tried to blame Castro and his government. We could learn a lot from the Cubans and what they know. He basically solved the crime within weeks. He even named names. We did a whole episode on it. Russia. I mean, Oswald went to Russia, and they were our Cold War enemy. So there's files there somewhere we should get access to. You put all those together, we could learn a lot, because the only one that seemed like wasn't interested in the truth was our own government. Other governments, France even knew. Charles de Gaulle knew. Nailed it. I guess we could go ask the rest of the world, hey, can you tell us what happened in our own city of Dallas, November 22nd, 1963? We'd like to know. The U.S. Justice Department should offer amnesty and waive government secrecy pledges for all those with relevant testimony. Most of these people are dead. There's not going to be very many of them. What are you hiding? We should use the advances in technology to settle disputes regarding such as like the dicta belt, the police recording. And he names a particular laboratory. He says, with the technology we have at our disposal today, a lot of these questions, a lot of these disputes could be solved. The evidence the Warren Commission provided, these autopsy photos, the photo of Oswald, the backyard photo, the x-rays, and the photos of Oswald allegedly at Mexico City in front of the Soviet embassy. There's so much that technology could look and discern whether those are fakes or not. Are those real? The Kennedy family should get involved in this and release papers that it controls. The Kennedy family has fought disclosure of all things Kennedy related, JFK related, or Bobby, for years under the guise of family privacy. Well, last time I checked, the Kennedys have made a living as a family out of public service. A lot of their income has come from the U.S. taxpayers. And two of them, one of them was a president, one of them was fixing to be president, and both got assassinated. One's running for president right now. I think they owe the country this. I think they should release all the papers, any evidence that they have under their control. Instead of fighting it, they should release it and let the chips fall where they may. I know they're trying to protect reputations and legends and all that kind of stuff, but there's some things that are just more important. If they cared about the future of our country, like they say they do, and I believe that they do care. I do believe that. I believe Bobby when I hear him speak, Bobby Jr. But they always stop just short. And I think they could go a long way, like the King family. The King family just keeps fighting for truth about the assassination of Martin. They won't let it lie. The Kennedy family just accepted the Warren Commission conclusions and just rolled over. Two different approaches. I started this back on January 7th, but I really started this in 1997 when I began researching because I could not answer questions my students had. And I've been on this journey ever since. During that time, I've had opportunities to speak or opportunities to to do publicly what I'm doing now. And other than writing a couple books about it, I basically resisted the urge to do that because I never felt like I knew enough. And there are other people out there that know more, and people should listen to them, not me. And I talked myself out of it for years. In the last few years, I've grown increasingly aware that I'm getting older. I've got kids, I've got grandkids now. And you start asking yourself, what kind of country are you leaving? What have you done to make it a better place for them? And I'm not a politician. I don't think I'm ever going to run for office. Um, what can I do? That's the question. What can I do? I believe America lost its innocence on November 22nd, 1963. And I've spent almost 30 years researching it. And I have all this knowledge in my head and on paper and PowerPoints, and I'm constantly researching it and reading about it. But what am I doing with it? That was the question that kept coming through my head. What are you doing with it? Well, my answer would be I teach my students. Well, that's your job. What are you doing with it beyond that? So I took the plunge and I'm doing this now to make a small difference. And I'm hoping that enough people see and hear this and they catch a vision as well. And they ask themselves the same question: what can I do? We all have our little areas of expertise. And I'm not calling myself an expert. There's many people out there know more about, have forgotten more about JFK and the assassination than I know. But we all have a responsibility to do something. We can't just shirk our responsibility and let other people try to carry it and then complain about it if we're not willing to do something. So this is me stopping what I used to do, which is complain, and doing my small part to make a difference. And I just hope that this series has sparked something in somebody who can carry the ball a little further. I've carried the ball as far as I can go, and I'm not going to stop. I'm going to continue to research and dig. It's an obsession of mine now. It's in me, and maybe someday I'll update and I'll do more. But as it comes along. But at this point, on this day, the 23rd of May, I've concluded this series and I've done my part. I've put it on YouTube free. I've spent a lot of time and energy putting this together, and so I've done my part. I have a clean conscience. I feel good about it. And when people ask me, I can refer them to this channel and they can delve into it as deep as they want. So my question to you is, what is your part? What part can you play? What can you offer that next generation or the next two generations to say, I want my kids someday to go back and be able to access these and say, hey, you know what, my dad, he did a lot of research on this, and this is what he thought, and this is what he believed. And he put his, he went public with it. I remember my father, I talked about this with my father, this very topic, and his attitude was, it's been decided, who cares? It's spilt milk. And I just couldn't adopt that same attitude about it. And maybe it's because we're from different generations. He came from a generation that believed what the government and the institutions told him. I come from a different time. And quite frankly, I've put a lot of time and effort into studying this. And what I've learned has pushed me further away from that belief that I was raised with, to believe whatever our leaders tell us and not question authority. So I conclude with that. I thank you for listening. I enjoyed all your comments. I will continue to as we go forward from here. But I thoroughly enjoyed this process. I thank you all for listening. And I hope you've enjoyed it. And I hope this is the beginning of something, not the end of something. And you can check out my website, sphistory.com. You can check out all the content I have there. You can give me a review if you think this channel deserves it. You can check the notification bell. You might need that going forward because I'm not going to be on the same schedule. You can subscribe to my channel. It's free. You can give me a thumbs up. You can comment. You can share. Thank you. God bless. Have a great weekend.